In this clip I want to show you how oxbow lakes form. Basically they form as a result of cutoff of river bends. So here on the slide we have a river and it's meandering along, and this bend over here is really strongly curved. Sometimes when bends migrate laterally as a result of deposition on the point bar and erosion on the cut banks, sometimes they do get more strongly curved or highly sinuous like this one. And the process doesn't require a super curved bend like this one is, but I think it'll be easier to see what's happening if we use this strongly curved bend. So during a flood, when there's a lot of discharge in the river might take a shortcut and just go across this narrow strip of land here between the upstream and the downstream end of this really tight bend instead of going all the way around. And if the flow is strong enough, it can erode through that neck of land and carve out a new channel. That little new channel segment there is called a chute channel. So if that's deep enough, it'll stay open even when the flood waters go down, flood levels go down. And typically then you'll have the river go partly through the chute channel and partly through the old bend segment around the old bend. And water really does want to take the path of least resistance. So more and more of the flow will just go straight through the chute channel instead of going all the way around that curved segment there, and that decreases the flow and the flow velocities in the bend segment. So you start to get deposition as you get more and more sluggish flow in the old bend segment, and the deposition tends to be concentrated initially on the upstream and the downstream ends of that old curved channel segment. So what happens is that eventually that deposition is going to cut off that old bend from the main flow of the river. And the river's not going to go around there anymore, except during floods when the water level's high and can get over these plugs of sediment on the upstream end and the downstream end and can get into that old bend segment. So then you can still have, for long periods of time, decades or more, you can have standing water in this old bend segment, and the standing water in there is referred to as an oxbow lake. Now I want to show you an example of a less tightly curved bend on a river where that process happened but was incomplete. So I want to go over to this slide. So this is a picture of the Calamus River. It's in north central Nebraska in a region called the Sand Hills, for all those little hills off in the distance up in here, which are actually old wind-blown sand dunes that are now covered with grass. But anyway, I want you to look at these two bends here, and each of those bends has an island in it, and we're going to look a little bit more at this downstream one. And this is an example over here of a chute channel. The river used to just go around this bend here, and all this was floodplain formed from lateral migration of the point bar over time. But during a flood, the river cut across that point bar and formed this chute channel in here. And then in the next slide we're going to stand on a low terrace right about in here, and we're going to look downstream, and that's going to mean we're looking at the upstream end of that island. So here's the island, and we're looking at the upstream end here, and this is the chute channel over here on the right, and over to the left is the old bend segment, and you can see this is the cut bank over here on the outside of that bend. Walking around the island, or I guess I should say wading around the island, you can see that there's deposition going on at both the upstream and the downstream ends of the island. Like I said, that these bends that are undergoing cutoff, they do tend to fill in at the upstream and the downstream ends first. So in the next picture, we're going to be looking at another bend in the Calamus River. It's located way upstream from the reach that we were looking at a moment ago. And this is it here. And this is one where the bend has been completely cut off. The present day river's over here, flowing this way. And so this is the old cut bank of that old bend segment, and this was the point bar over here that migrated laterally for a time. And so you can see that the upstream end of that old bend is high and dry because it's more completely filled. It started filling in first. And it's out of the picture, but the same is true of the downstream end of that old bend. It's also higher and drier than this area in here, which is, you would not call this an Oxbow lake. But this is what happens eventually to Oxbow lakes. They gradually fill in with sediment. That's because during floods, the water will spill out over onto the banks and get into this old bend segment here, bring sediment into the Oxbow lake, and very, very gradually over time, that bend will fill in with sediment. And it usually ends up like what you see here is just a marshy area, a wetland, a small wetland on the floodplain. So instead of calling this an Oxbow lake, you'd call this an abandoned channel segment. And it's another very, very common floodplain feature.